You asked me why I never left this place. I have heard that question before. From neighbors who thought they were being kind. From Hartwell's lawyer who came with paperwork and the smooth voice of a man who made a living persuading widows to sell. From my brother down in Missouri who wrote every winter asking when I was finally coming home. But nobody ever asked it the way you just did. Sitting down, looking me straight in the face, and meaning it. So I am going to tell you. All of it. But I need you to understand something before I begin. The answer is not the land. It is not the cattle. It is not because I was too proud to quit, though people have always preferred to think so. The answer starts on an October afternoon when the Montana wind was finding every crack in these old boards, and I was standing right where you are standing now, with a rifle in my hands and a heart heavy as river stone. The wind in Montana is not like wind anywhere else. I grew up in Illinois, where wind moves across flat cornfields and only bends the wheat. That kind of wind you can stand in without leaning. It passes through you. Montana wind passes through your bones. The first time Samuel brought me out to this land 4 years before in summer, when the grass was green and the mountains looked almost gentle from a distance, I stood on the empty ground where this house now stands and felt that north wind come down off the peaks, and it went through every space between my thoughts, through everything I had believed was solid. I told Samuel the wind felt strange here. He smiled. He had a particular way of smiling, not because something was funny, but because he could see something I had not yet seen. You will get used to it, he said. And when you do, you will miss it every time it stops. I did not understand that then. I understood it the following autumn, 6 months after I put Samuel in the ground, when the north wind came back, and I stood alone on this porch, and for the first time that wind blew straight through me, without a shoulder beside me to turn toward. That October afternoon began the same as every other afternoon in those 6 empty months. I woke before the sun. I had not been sleeping much, not from grief exactly, though grief was there. The ranch did not allow grief to stretch out and take up space. 300 head of cattle needed checking. The north fence had lost another post since yesterday. The water trough for the stock had clogged again the second time that week. The third board from the left in the horse barn was talking in that particular way old wood talks when it is about to give up entirely. I made coffee, sat down with the ledger, counted numbers. That was the thing that carried me through those first months. Numbers. They do not lie to you. They do not offer comfort that evaporates by Thursday. They do not look at you with that particular expression, that mixture of pity and relief, that it is your sorrow and not theirs, the way neighbors do when they bring food in the first week, and then less in the second week, and then nothing at all, once they realize a widow's work is a well that never empties, and human kindness is only so deep. Numbers only ask you to keep going. So I kept going. That morning, I rode out alone to check the north fence, same as every morning. The ground had begun to harden. Not frozen yet, but the softness of summer was gone, replaced by something firmer and colder and more deliberate. The grass had gone yellow in that particular way that only dying things go yellow, vivid and extravagant, as if spending everything that remains before the snow comes. I knew the snow would come soon. I knew I was not ready for it, not in terms of food or firewood or any practical thing. Ready in some other way I had not yet found the word for. I fixed the fence, drove a new post into the hard ground. I stood and looked at that sky, and I thought about the list of things to fix tomorrow. That was how I survived those months. Do not look at the sky too long. Come back to the list. I was about to go back inside the sky, still holding its last thin light, when I heard hoofbeats. Not one horse. 2. And they were coming this direction. I went still. Visitors were rare out this far, especially near dark. People with honest business came during daylight hours. People who came near dark usually carried something they did not want discussed under a clear sky. That was the unwritten law of the frontier, and I had learned it not from any book, but from the education that land and loss provide. I stepped inside, put my hand on the rifle that rested against the doorframe, Samuel's rifle, the one I had spent my first year here learning to shoot, because Samuel said, "This is not Illinois, Abigail. You have to know how to protect yourself." I was not a natural shot, but I was steady enough. I walked back out to the porch with the rifle in my hand, not raised, not hidden, just held in the way that says it is here, if it becomes necessary. 2 riders stopped at the gate. I watched them in the fading light. The first was a man tall, wearing a long coat, the color of something that had once been brown before too many seasons worked it over. He sat his horse the way a man sits who has spent long days in the saddle for more years than he can count, not the straight-backed posture of a soldier, but the natural settled straightness of someone for whom the saddle has long been a second body. The second rider, I stopped. The second rider was not a man. It was a child, small. Sitting behind the man, both hands gripped into his coat. In the failing light, I could not make out a face, only a small shape hair loose in the wind and 2 small hands holding on tight. Those 2 hands. I do not know why I fixed on them and could not look away. Perhaps because they were holding too hard, not the grip of a child afraid of falling, but the grip of a child who had learned early that letting go means losing. Those small hands were holding onto the only thing they had left to hold. I knew that feeling. The man dismounted first. Slow and deliberate, not slow from age, but slow from caution, aware of the rifle in my hands, and careful not to do anything that might read wrong. I noted that. He took his hat off. Black hair gray, coming in at the temples. A face darkened by weather the way only men who live outdoors all year go dark. Not even all over, but marked in particular places where the sun had its habits. Wide jaw, deep-set eyes. He was not handsome in any storybook way, but he had the face of a man who had witnessed a great deal and had long since given up the habit of pretending otherwise. "Ma'am," he said, low voice, unhurried. "My name is Eli Calloway. I was told you might be needing a ranch hand." I did not lower the rifle. "Who told you that?" "Ruth Hadley, the general store in town." Ruth Hadley. I knew Ruth. Everyone in the valley knew Ruth, 48 years old, had run that store alone since her husband passed 10 years back. Knew everything in the valley, from wheat prices to land disputes, and never said anything without a practical reason behind it. "You walked into her store and asked." I asked if anyone in the area needed a hired hand. He said it plainly, no decoration around it. "She thought of you." Nothing more complicated than that. No rehearsed story, no carefully constructed reason. Just a man who walked in and asked a straight question and was pointed here. I had not lowered the rifle, but I was listening. "Where are you coming from?" "North. The Beartooth Range." A brief pause. "My daughter and I have been riding 3 weeks." Daughter. I looked at the child still sitting on the horse. I could see her more clearly now, 5 years old, perhaps no more. Wearing a brown dress gone thin at the hem, the bottom lengthened by a strip of different fabric, as if the person who sewed it had tried their best but did not have enough matching cloth. Hair as dark as her father's, loose in the evening wind. And her eyes, she was looking at me from up on that horse, not looking away, not shy, not giving much away. Just looking, steady and quiet, the way a child looks who learned early that watching is safer than speaking. Then the child slid down off the horse. No asking permission, no looking at her father. She came down the way a person comes down from something they have done 1,000 times, and when her feet touched the ground, she did not look at me, did not look at the house, did not look at anything in that yard. She walked straight to the well, stood there, looked down into it, did not speak, just stood and looked down into that dark water in the last of the light, the way you look when you are listening for something below the surface that other people cannot hear. I do not know how long I stood there, watching her, before I noticed that my arm had dropped. I had lowered the rifle without knowing I was doing it. Years later, when I have told this story, people always ask me why. Why trust a stranger on the basis of a hat taken off and a few plain words? Why not send them away and close the gate and do the sensible thing a woman alone ought to do? I did not lower that rifle because Eli Calloway persuaded me. He had not said enough to persuade anyone. I lowered it because that child stood at my well with the posture of a little girl who had learned to find water for herself, not waiting for someone to show her, not asking if there was a well, just going to it, looking in, confirming. No child learns that in a house where the grown people handle everything. I knew that truth from the inside. I had been a child who learned early how to manage on her own, not because my parents were hard people, but because life sometimes teaches you things before you are old enough to enroll in the lesson. And I recognized that posture from a long way off, the way you recognize something that once belonged to you. The girl turned and looked at me, straight. No shyness, no friendliness, no hostility either. Just a look, the assessing kind, from a child who had learned to study a situation before deciding anything about it. Then she turned back to the well, and I, standing on this porch with the rifle at my side, thought about the thing I had been trying not to think about. "What is her name?" I asked. "Evangeline." He glanced toward her. "We call her Evie." I should tell you about the town, because without the town you cannot fully understand why this story went the way it did. Caldwell Creek was not large, never had been, and likely never would be. It sat in the valley between two mountain ranges, in the particular way that made the railroad go around it, and when the railroad goes around a town, that town does not grow. That was the law of the West in those years. You sit on the railroad's path, you grow. You don't, and you live on what the land gives and what people carry through. Caldwell Creek lived on cattle and grain and winter. Mostly winter, because the winters there ran long enough and hard enough to keep people from leaving, and people who stay long enough in one place become a community, whether they intend to or not. There was Ruth Hadley's general store open 6 days a week, including rain. There was the small pine-board church where Father Martin preached every Sunday in the tone of a man who had made peace with the fact that half his congregation was mentally tallying cattle during his sermons. There was Marshal Cole Brennan's office, one room, an old desk, a gun cabinet where the law existed in whatever measure Brennan had the manpower to enforce it. There was Billy Crane's saloon, where men came not so much to drink as to sit in the warmth of other human beings during the coldest months. And there was Cyrus Hartwell. Hartwell had no office in town. He did not need one. He had the largest ranch in the territory, 3,000 acres to the east, more cattle than his hired men could count in a full working day, and a name heavy enough that people paused before speaking ill of him, even inside their own homes. Caldwell Creek did not belong to Hartwell, but Hartwell understood its shape the way water understands the shape of its container. No force required, simply filling the spaces that already existed. He bought land from people who could not survive another winter. He extended loans at terms that anyone who could do arithmetic knew could not be repaid on schedule. He did not make threats, not the kind that could be proven in front of Brennan. He simply remained, patient and immovable. And the land slowly came to him. Samuel knew this. Samuel knew it better than most because the Thornfield land sat on ground Hartwell had wanted before Samuel ever purchased it, and Samuel had said no. Twice. He did not live to say it a third time. I had suspected that from the beginning. But suspicion and evidence are two entirely different things, and a widow who accuses Cyrus Hartwell without proof in this valley is not making a claim. She is making a target of herself. So I had stayed quiet. I worked. I waited for something I did not know what to shift the weight of things. The week before Eli Calloway appeared at my gate, I had gone into town for supplies, and Ruth Hadley said something to me in that particular way of hers, in her ordinary voice, while counting change, as if she were discussing flower prices. "Hartwell has asked to buy your land 3 times this month, Abigail." I took my change and put it in my pocket. He can ask 3 more times. The answer will not change. Ruth looked at me for a moment. He does not usually ask 3 times. I did not ask her what she meant by that, we both already knew. That was the water running beneath the surface of that October afternoon. That was what lived underneath everything as I stood on this porch watching two riders come up the road toward my gate. A man and a child, one looking for work, one looking for warmth. And me standing here with a rifle going slowly quiet in my hands. The sky had finished going dark. The north wind came down the valley, carrying the smell of snow that was still somewhere up in the mountains, but would not stay there long. Evie pulled her small shoulders together against the cold, but did not move from the well. Eli stood at the gate with his hat in his hands, waiting without pressing. I looked at him. His coat had been patched in at least 3 places I could see from where I stood. 3 different threads, as if 3 separate winters had each left their mark on it. His boots were worn near through at the heel. But his hands were clean. Not freshly washed clean. Clean in the way of a man who keeps a habit even when no one is requiring it of him. I noticed small things. Samuel used to say, I notice too much. I used to tell him there is no such thing as too much noticing. Can you handle cattle? I asked. Yes. Fence work? Yes. You ever walk away from a job before it was finished? He considered that. Once, the man who hired me lied about what the job was. That was the most honest answer he could have given. A man who says never is lying to you. A man who tells you the exception and the reason is telling you something true. 2 weeks, I said. $30 a month and board. You work well, we talk further. You don't, you find somewhere else. Understood? Understood. Put your horses in the barn, hay's in the loft. When you're done, come inside. I have stew on the stove. I turned and went inside before he could say thank you. I did not want to hear it. I wanted to get back to the stove and have something to do with my hands while my head worked through what I had just decided. Inside the kitchen, I stood before the shelf and looked at it. 4 bowls. I had always kept 4. Samuel used to say, keep extra Abigail people out here show up without warning. In 6 months, I had used 1. The smallest one, the bowl I ate supper from alone each night, sitting with the ledger, then setting it in the wash basin and going to bed. I needed 3 now. I stood looking at that shelf longer than was necessary. Not because I did not know what to do, but because for the first time since Samuel passed, I was going to set more than 1 bowl on this table, and my hands paused in the particular way that has no rational explanation. I took 3 bowls down, set them on the table, added 2 more spoons, pulled 2 more chairs into place, stood and looked at a table set for 3. Outside, I could hear movement in the barn, horses being settled, water going into the trough. The sounds of someone who knew what needed doing and did it without being told. I went back to the stove and stirred the pot. They knocked when the kitchen was warm. I opened the door and stopped for just a moment. They stood there, Eli and Evie. They had washed their hands and faces as well as the barn allowed. Evie's hair had been braided quickly, imperfectly done by a man's hands that were not accustomed to the work, but done. Eli stood straight, hat in hand, hair combed back. Evie stood beside him, one hand loosely holding the edge of his coat. I stepped aside. Come in. Evie stepped in first. She stopped just inside the doorway and looked around at the fire burning low in the stove, at the quilts hung on the wall, at the table set with 3 bowls, at the oil lamp on the windowsill, throwing its small warm circle against the glass. She looked at all of it the way someone looks when they are making an inventory, noting each thing carefully. Then she said very quietly, "It's warm." Not warm, meaning the temperature. I heard the difference. She said warm meaning the thing inside a place that not every place has, the thing that takes longer than heat to build and outlasts cold by a long distance. Eli glanced at her, then looked away. "Evie," he said low. "It's all right," I said. "Would you like to help me set the table?" She looked at me. For the first time since coming through that door, she looked directly at my face. Then she gave one small, solemn nod, the nod of someone agreeing to a specific arrangement, not just being polite. She took the small cloth doll I had not noticed until that moment. She had been keeping it tucked under her arm and set it carefully on the chair nearest the window. Set it down gently and precisely the way you set a real person into their own seat. Then she turned and helped me. Eli stayed near the door, not moving further in, like a man who had not yet been given full permission. "Sit down," I said, my back to him. "Food's almost ready." That supper had more silence in it than words. Eli ate slowly. Not slowly from lack of hunger, I could see the hunger from where I stood, but slowly from the carefulness of a man relearning how to eat at another person's table. Setting the spoon down between bites. Not resting his elbows on the wood. Small things, the kind a person was taught long ago and has not practiced in so long, they have to think before doing them. Evie finished her bowl completely, looked at what remained in the pot, said nothing. I served her more without asking. She looked up at me. A quick look, not quite gratitude in words, but something in the neighborhood of it. Then she bent back to her bowl. At the end of the meal, she set her spoon down straight alongside the bowl parallel to the table's edge. I looked at that spoon. That was not something a child decides on her own. That was something taught. Something repeated until it became reflex. Something a mother had patiently shown her daughter until it no longer required thinking. I turned back to the stove and busied my hands. 2 weeks, I said, my back to the room. Starting tomorrow morning, before first light. I'll be there before first light, Eli said. I did not turn around. I know. After I showed them to the small storage room off the kitchen, 2 bedrolls, a small lamp, not much, but out of the cold, I stood alone in the kitchen and looked at the 3 bowls drying on the shelf. 3 bowls. My hands rested on the edge of the wash basin. Through the thin wall, I could hear Eli's voice, low and indistinct, settling his daughter for the night. I could not make out the words, only the rhythm of it, the rhythm of a person saying it is all right now, in every way that can be said without using those exact words. I put out the kitchen lamp, stood in the dark for a while, only the faint glow of the cook stove's coals giving any light. Outside, the Montana wind kept moving through the valley, cold and indifferent, the way it had blown before any of us arrived and would blow long after all of us were gone. But tonight, for the first time in 6 months, I stood in the dark of this kitchen, listening to that wind, and somewhere in the thinking part of my mind, quiet as a candle being lit in a far room, was the thought that perhaps the winter coming toward us would not be as long as I had been preparing myself for it to be. I did not know why I thought that. I only knew that I stood there looking at the dying coals, and I thought about a table set with 3 bowls and about a small cloth doll sitting alone on the chair by the window in the dark, now as if keeping a place for someone not yet home. And that is where it all begins, child. Not with gunfire, not with promises or agreements or anything that announces itself as important. It begins with 3 bowls on a table and a little girl standing at a well looking down, and a woman on a porch who lowered her rifle before she knew she was doing it. The things that change a life do not always arrive like thunder. Sometimes they arrive like a knock on the door, and sometimes the bravest thing you ever do is simply open it. Still as told by Abigail Thornfield, picking up the thread of that first week and what grew from it quietly, the way most important things grow. The first morning, I woke at 4, and he was already in the barn. I know because I stood at the kitchen window with my coffee and watched the lantern light move behind the barn boards, slow and steady. Not hurried, the way a man moves when he is working by himself and has no one to perform for. I had not asked him to start before sunrise. I had said before first light, which is a different thing. Before first light means you are up and ready. It does not mean you are already an hour into the work. I stood at that window longer than I intended. Then I sat down with the ledger and opened it to that morning's page and made myself look at numbers instead. By the end of the 3rd day, Eli Calloway had repaired the north fence, fixed the broken hinge on the chicken coop, replaced the 3rd board from the left in the horse barn, and cleared the blockage in the stock trough that I had been fighting with for 2 weeks. He did not ask me how I wanted things done. He looked at what was broken, figured out what it needed, and did it. The north fence he had taken apart further than I would have pulled out 2 posts I had thought were still solid and reset them deeper and truer than the original line. I walked that fence the morning after he finished it and pressed my weight against each post, and not one of them moved. I did not tell him the fence was good. I went back inside and wrote it in the ledger. North fence repaired. Solid. That was my version of a compliment in those days. Writing something down as done and not writing any complaint beside it. He found a rhythm with the ranch the way a man finds a trail in the dark, not by seeing it, but by following what his feet already know quietly without announcing itself, simply taking the shape of what was needed. He was in the barn before me each morning. He was still working when I came out after supper to do the evening check. I began to time my rounds differently without quite deciding to, so that we crossed paths at the water trough around mid-morning, and I could tell him what needed doing next without it being a formal conversation. We were not yet talking. Not really. We were communicating, which is a different thing. Communicating is the exchange of information necessary to accomplish a task. Talking is when you say something you did not plan to say. That came later. Evie changed the shape of my days in ways I had not expected and would not have predicted if you had asked me the evening they arrived. The morning after their first night, I came into the kitchen and found her already sitting at the table. Not eating, not touching anything. Just sitting, hands folded in her lap, watching the stove as if she was waiting for it to do something interesting. She had her doll beside her on the chair. "Good morning," I said. She looked at me, nodded once. "Are you hungry?" Another nod. I made oatmeal, set a bowl in front of her. She ate it carefully the same way she had eaten the stew the night before, not fast, not slow, but with the particular attentiveness of a child who had learned not to assume there would be more. When she finished, she carried her bowl to the wash basin without being asked. She was 5 years old, and she carried her bowl to the wash basin without being asked. I turned away and found something that needed doing at the counter. She began following me that first week. Not always close. Sometimes she kept a room's distance, or stood in the doorway while I worked inside, or sat on the porch steps while I moved around the yard. But she followed, silent and steady, like a small shadow that had decided I was the right person to shadow for now. She helped collect eggs on the second day. I had not invited her. She simply appeared beside me when I went to the chicken coop, took the basket handle on one side, while I held the other, and walked in with me. The hens, who were suspicious of strangers in my experience, did not seem to mind her. She moved among them slowly and spoke to them in a murmur too low for me to make out, and they stepped aside for her without complaint. "You have done this before," I said. She looked up at me, considered the question seriously the way she considered most things, then held up 3 fingers, 3 chickens. They had kept 3 chickens on whatever mountain they had lived on. "Ours laid more on some days than others," I said. "These are the same way. You cannot take it personally." Something moved at the corner of her mouth. Not quite a smile, but in the neighborhood. On the 4th evening, I was mending a torn shirt by the fire needle and thread, the particular kind of sewing that is not decorative, but functional, the kind that is about making something hold together rather than making it look well. Evie came and sat beside me on the bench. Close, but not touching. She watched my hands. After a while, she reached out one small finger and touched the spool of thread. Not taking it, just touching. "Would you like to try?" I asked. She looked at the needle, then at me. Then she nodded. I threaded a second needle with a shorter length. Found a scrap of canvas in the mending basket thick enough to practice on, forgiving enough that mistakes would not matter. I showed her how to hold the needle, how to push it through, and pull it, even how to keep the stitches close and tight. "Small stitches make strong fabric," I told her. "Big stitches look faster, but they pull apart. Take your time." She bent over the canvas with her tongue pressed between her teeth, concentrating with the whole of her small body. Her first stitches were uneven. She looked at them, looked at mine, and pulled them out. Started again. I did not tell her to start again. She decided that herself. I kept my eyes on my own work so she would not feel watched. But from the edge of my sight, I could see her, the bent dark head, the careful hands, the expression of a child who intended to get something right. From across the room, Eli was cleaning a piece of tack by the lamp. He was not looking at his hands. He was looking at his daughter. I did not look at him directly. But I saw what was on his face, and I made a point of not looking at it for long because it was the kind of expression that belongs to a person privately and not to anyone else's eyes. He was watching Evie learn to sew, and his face held the weight of everything that moment meant to him, everything it replaced and everything it could not replace, and the complicated gratitude of a man who is watching his daughter receive something he could not give her himself. I kept my eyes on my mending. Some things you witness by not watching. The week had been going well enough that I had almost stopped waiting for it to stop going well. That was my particular weakness in those months. I had become so accustomed to difficulty that ease made me suspicious. When the fence held, I checked it again. When the cattle moved without trouble, I rode the perimeter, looking for what I might have missed. When 3 days passed without anything breaking down or threatening to, I sat with the ledger in the evening and looked for the number I had forgotten to account for. Samuel used to say I borrowed trouble from the future. I told him I preferred to call it planning ahead. We had argued about that more than once lightly, the way people argue about the things they love about each other. I did not borrow trouble that first week. I was too busy. But on the morning of the 8th day, I rode into Caldwell Creek for supplies, and the town reminded me that ease has a limited lifespan on the frontier. Ruth Hadley was behind her counter when I came in sorting mail into the wooden cubbies on the back wall. She did not turn around immediately, which meant she already knew it was me. Ruth knew the sound of every regular customer's boots on her floor. "Morning, Abigail." "Morning, Ruth." I gave her my list. She pulled items from shelves with the efficiency of a woman who had done this 10,000 times and did not need to look at the labels anymore. We talked about the weather, the cold coming in earlier than last year, the quality of the winter wheat, whether Tom Patterson's East Field would hold up. The ordinary conversation of two women who have known each other long enough to speak in shorthand. Then Ruth set a sack of flour on the counter and said without changing her tone at all, "People are talking about the man staying at your place." I counted out money. "People talk about everything." "They do," she agreed. "They are saying he is dangerous, that he killed a man up in the mountains some years back." She paused. "I thought you should hear it from me before you heard it from someone with less goodwill behind it." I laid the coins on the counter. "What else are they saying?" "That a widow woman has no business taking in a stranger." Ruth met my eyes. "The usual things people say when they are more comfortable with your trouble than your solutions." I picked up the nearest sack. "Thank you, Ruth." "Hartwell's man was in here day before yesterday," she said, quieter now. "Morrison, asking questions about the Thornfield place. How many hands you were running, whether the north pasture fence was holding." I went still. Morrison. I had seen Pike Morrison twice from a distance, once outside Hartwell's property line, once riding through town, and both times I had the particular feeling I associated with weather that has not yet arrived but is already being felt in the joints. He was a large man, pale-eyed, with a scar that pulled the left side of his mouth into a permanent expression of faint amusement. The kind of man who had learned to make his intentions unreadable and had been practicing long enough that it had become his natural face. "What did you tell him?" I asked. "That I sell flour and nails and do not keep inventory of other people's ranch hands." Ruth pushed the remaining items across the counter. "He did not seem satisfied with that answer." "He rarely seems satisfied with anything," I said. Ruth gave me a look that said she had more to tell me and had decided against it for now. "You take care of yourself out there, Abigail." I took my supplies and went out into the morning cold. On my way to the wagon, I passed two women I recognized from the church, Margaret Hollis and her sister-in-law, whose name I never remembered correctly. They saw me coming, and I watched the calculation happen on Margaret's face, the brief pause, the decision, the bright social smile that replaced whatever had been there before. "Abigail, how are you managing?" "Well enough," I said. "And you?" "Oh, we get by." A pause that was not accidental. "We heard you have taken on some help. A man from up north somewhere." "I hired a ranch hand," I said. "The ranch needed one." "Of course." Margaret nodded in the particular way that means the opposite of agreement. "Only, well, people do wonder, you know. A woman alone with a strange man on the property. What Samuel would have thought." I looked at her for a moment. "Samuel," I said, "would have thought about the north fence and the 300 head of cattle and the winter coming in 6 weeks. He was a practical man." I picked up my remaining sacks and put them in the wagon. On the seat beside me on the drive home, I thought about what Ruth had said. Morrison asking about the north pasture fence, about how many hands I was running. Hartwell was measuring me, estimating what I had and what I lacked. And the fact that he was still measuring meant he had not yet decided I was entirely without resources. That thought was both reassuring and frightening in equal measure. I had not told Eli about Hartwell yet. I told myself I was waiting for the right moment. The more honest explanation is that I was waiting to know whether he was going to stay past 2 weeks before I handed him a reason to leave sooner. But that evening, I came back from town and found him at the well washing his hands at the end of the workday, and something in his face, when he saw me, a slight sharpening of attention, told me he could see I had come back carrying something beyond flour and salt pork. He did not ask. He dried his hands and waited. That was when I understood something about Eli Calloway that would take me longer to put into words. He had a quality of patience that was not passive. It was not the patience of a man with nowhere to go. It was the patience of a man who had learned that most of the important information in any situation arrives on its own schedule, and pushing it only makes it come in wrong. "People in town are talking," I said. "About me," he said. "Not a question. About you, and about a man you killed." The evening light was going amber and thin. He looked at his hands a moment, then back at me. "That's true," he said. "I killed a man." I waited. "His name was Morrison," he said. The air between us went very still. "Pike Morrison," I said slowly. Something shifted in Eli's expression. "You know him." "He works for Cyrus Hartwell. He was in the general store 2 days ago asking questions about this property." Eli was quiet for a long moment, the kind of quiet that is not emptiness, but calculation, a man sorting through information and understanding what it connects to. "Then he is not dead," Eli said. "I thought I had killed him. He was breathing when I left. I will not tell you, there was time to be certain." He looked at me steadily. "I owe you the full truth of it. You should have it before you decide what to do with it." "Tell me," I said. So he did. He had been living up in the Beartooth Range for 3 years, him, his wife Martha, and Evie, who was barely 2, when they first went up. He had staked a claim on a parcel of land along a creek, built a cabin by hand, run a small trap line in winter, and kept a kitchen garden in summer. It was not a wealthy life, but it was a life that was entirely theirs, and they had built it from nothing and taken care of it, and it had taken care of them in return. Martha got sick in the second winter. Not desperately at first, a cough that came and stayed, a tiredness that did not lift with rest. By spring, she was better enough that they believed the worst was behind them. By the following autumn, they knew it was not. Morrison came in November of that year. 3 men with him. They had papers Eli did not know then whether the papers were legal or invented. And it did not ultimately matter, because legal papers obtained through Hartwell's methods occupied a space between law and fraud that Brennan's jurisdiction could not easily reach. The papers said the land belonged to a holding company. The holding company, Eli later understood, was one of several names Hartwell used when he did not want his own name on a transaction. Martha was lying in the bed in the back room. She could hear everything. Eli told me this part slowly. He was not a man who used many words to begin with, and these particular words had been kept somewhere airless for a long time and came out with the particular weight of things that have been compressed. Morrison told him he had 2 days to vacate. Eli said he was not leaving. Morrison said he did not have a choice in the matter. And then, and this was the part that Eli said, in the flattest voice of all the voice of a man reporting a fact that still had not fully become real to him. Even years later, Morrison glanced toward the back room, toward the sound of Martha coughing, and he smiled. Not a cruel smile, something worse than cruel. The smile of a man who finds the situation convenient. Eli hit him before the smile finished forming. What followed was not something Eli described in detail, and I did not ask him to. He said Morrison went down hard against the doorframe. He said the other men left quickly once they saw what Eli intended to do with the rifle he had picked up. He said he did not know when he finally stopped whether Morrison was dead or only badly hurt, and he had not waited to find out, because Martha was calling from the back room, and she was his entire concern at that moment. Martha died 6 weeks later. Evie was not yet 3 years old. I packed what we could carry, Eli said. We have been moving since. He looked out at the dark mountains on the horizon. Most places a man with a small child can find work for a season. Most places do not want us for longer than that. The child is... He stopped. A complication, I said. That is their word for her. His voice was flat saying it. I have different words. I looked at him. So do I. He met my eyes then, a brief thing, but direct. If Morrison is alive and working for Hartwell, he said, and Hartwell wants this land, then my being here makes your situation more complicated, not less. He said it evenly, without drama. I will understand if you want us gone. The wind moved through the yard. Somewhere in the barn, a horse shifted and settled. I thought about the north fence repaired truer than it had ever been. I thought about 3 bowls on the table. I thought about Evie carrying her bowl to the wash basin without being asked. You said you were here for 2 weeks, I said. You have 9 days left. Go finish what you started on the East Trough. He looked at me for a moment. Then he nodded once and picked up his tools. That night, I could not sleep. I lay in the dark and listened to the wind working at the house, and I thought about what Eli had told me, and about what Ruth had told me, and about Morrison in the general store asking which fences were holding. And I thought about Samuel. I have not told many people about the last evening Samuel was alive. Not because I could not bear to tell it exactly, but because telling it required me to say a thing about myself that I did not like, which is that I had missed something I should have seen. He came home late that evening, later than usual, and he had not said he would be late. I was already at the table with the supper cooling when I heard his horse in the yard, and when he came in, his face had something in it I recognized as worry, but not the ordinary kind, not the worry about weather or cattle prices. Something deeper and more private, something he was carrying behind his eyes. I asked him what was wrong. He smiled, that particular smile. Nothing, he said. Long day. And I believed him. That was the thing I could not put down in all the months after. Not his death on the frontier was a violence you learned to absorb however long the absorbing took. What I could not put down was that I had looked at my husband's face and seen worry he was trying to hide from me, and I had accepted the easy answer because accepting it was simpler than insisting on the truth. He had been trying to protect me. I understood that. Samuel was a good man, and protecting me was his instinct and his habit. But he had protected me right out of the chance to protect him back. And I had let him, because some part of me had been willing to be protected. I had been a different woman then. I was not that woman anymore. I am going to tell you something I have not told anyone else. There was a child before Evie, before any of this. Mine and Samuel's, a baby that did not make it into the world. We were in our 2nd year on this land. The house was barely finished. The dream of the ranch was just starting to take a shape you could point to. I was 4 months along when I lost it. There was no warning and no explanation and no name to put on it because we had not yet settled on a name. Samuel sat outside on the ground by the barn wall for most of that night. I could see him from the bedroom window. He did not know what to do with what he was feeling, so he sat outside in the cold, where it was at least honest about being uncomfortable. I lay in the bed and felt something close up inside me. Quietly and completely, the way a door closes when the wind drops. We did not talk about it much afterward. That was the custom of the time and the place. You endured private sorrows privately, and you got up the next morning and you worked. I got up. I worked. And the closed thing inside me stayed closed, and after a while, it simply became part of the architecture of who I was, the way a healed-over scar becomes part of the skin. I had not thought about it in over a year when Eli's daughter wrapped her small arms around my waist in the kitchen doorway on the fourth evening and pressed her face against my side for no particular reason. She had simply been passing through and had paused and held on for a moment, the way small children sometimes do with people they have decided they trust. I stood very still with my hands at my sides. Then I put one hand on the back of her head. She let go and continued on her way as if nothing of consequence had occurred. I stood in the kitchen with my hand still raised, reaching toward where she had been. I am not going to tell you what I felt in that moment because some things resist being put into language. I will only say that the door that had been closed for 2 years opened a small amount. Not much. Just enough to let in a change in the air. The real test of the arrangement came on the morning of the 11th day. I had been planning the cattle move for 2 weeks. The herd needed to come down from summer pasture before the first heavy snow trapped them up on the high meadow. 300 head across terrain that required at least 3 riders working together to manage without losing animals to the draws and gullies on the eastern slope. I had been trying not to think about how to do it with one person. I was at the table with the maps spread out, hand-drawn, Samuel's drawing his particular way of noting the terrain with small marks that I had learned to read when Eli came in for the morning coffee. He looked at the maps without speaking, looked at the route I had marked with a pencil line. "How many?" he asked. 312 head. He studied the map. His finger moved along the eastern slope, stopped at the draw I had been most worried about. "This is where you lose them if the weather turns." "Yes. We need to move them in stages, 50-60 at a time. Smaller groups are manageable in 2. That will take 3 days instead of 1. 3 days done right," he said, "or 1 day done badly." He was correct. I pulled the map toward me and started marking the staging points. Then he said, "Evie can ride sweep." I looked up. She is 5 years old. She has been on horseback since before she could walk. He said it plainly without pushing. She needs to feel useful, not managed. I looked at the map. I thought about the draw on the eastern slope and what it would mean to have a third set of eyes watching the flank. "If she stays between us," I said, "in the middle, not on the edge." "Agreed." When we told Evie she was riding with us, she went very still in the way. She went still when something mattered to her, and she was not sure she was allowed to show how much. Then she went to get her boots with a speed and decisiveness that was the most childlike thing I had seen her do. We rode out in the early morning gray, the 3 of us frost on the grass, catching the first pale light. The high meadow was golden with late-season grass, the herd fat and unhurried, not yet knowing what the change in temperature meant for them. Eli took the left flank. I held the right. Evie rode in the middle on her small mare Buttercup, sitting as tall as her small frame allowed, wearing the serious expression of someone given an actual responsibility. "Steady and calm," Eli told her as we started the first group moving. "Cattle feel what you feel. If you are calm, they are calm." She nodded without taking her eyes off the herd. She surprised us both. She anticipated a breakaway on the left before it happened, saw the heifer turning her head in that particular way that means a decision is being considered, and moved. Buttercup quietly to close the gap before the animal had fully committed to the idea of leaving. No rushing, no noise. She simply appeared where she needed to be. By midday, we had the first 120 animals settled in the lower pasture. "You did well today," Eli told her at the noon stop, handing her a piece of bread and hard cheese. She looked at him, then at me. There was a question in the look. I reached into my coat pocket, took out a silver dollar one I had put there that morning, thinking about what he had said about her needing to feel useful. I pressed it into her palm. "Professional workers get paid," I said. She stared at that coin for a long time, turned it over in her fingers, examining both sides. Then she closed her hand around it and held it against her chest, and the expression on her face was the most complicated thing I had ever seen on a child of 5. She was not happy exactly. It was larger than happiness. It was the expression of someone who has just been told without words that what they did mattered, that they were not simply present, that they had contributed something real to something real. I had to look away at the horizon for a moment. That evening, the kitchen smelled of bread, an attempt I had made with Evie in the late afternoon, while Eli finished the second stage of the cattle work. It had not gone entirely as planned. He walked in to find flour on the table, flour on Evie's dress flour on the side of my face, where I had pushed back my hair without thinking, and 2 loaves that were slightly lopsided, but had risen with honest effort. He stood in the doorway and looked at us. "Bread," I said with the gravity the situation deserved, "is a battle. Sometimes you win." Evie looked at him very seriously. "Sometimes the dough wins," she added. He laughed. Not a polite laugh, an actual laugh, surprised out of him the way laughter comes when a person has not expected to laugh and has no defense prepared. It changed his whole face, made him look younger and less careful, and entirely like someone I had not yet met. I found, unexpectedly, that I was smiling. It was the first time in 6 months that something in that kitchen had made me smile without me deciding to. It had simply happened. The way it used to happen in the before time, when Samuel would say something and my face would answer before my mind had considered whether to. We ate the bread that evening with the last of the good butter. It was slightly dense on one end and slightly too brown on the other. It was the best bread I had made in longer than I could account for. Evie fell asleep at the table before supper was finished, chin dropping toward her chest, still holding her silver dollar. Eli carried her to bed without waking her. He came back and sat across from me, and for a little while we did not speak the way you sometimes do not speak with a person when silence has become comfortable enough to inhabit. "She does not sleep easily," he said finally. "Usually. Out on the road, she woke at every sound." I looked at the doorway toward the back room. "She has not woken here," I said. He looked at the table. "No, she has not." The fire cracked in the stove. Outside, the wind was picking up, finding the higher registers it found on cold, clear nights, running along the roofline and looking for gaps. That was the evening it shifted for me. Not dramatically. Nothing announced itself. There was no moment I could put a marker beside and say there, that is the exact place. But something that had been arranged one way quietly rearranged itself into another way, and I became aware of it the way you become aware of a sound that has stopped only after it is gone. I had been managing this man's presence on my property. I had been observing him, categorizing him, deciding how much trust was appropriate and in what areas. I had been treating him the way you treat an arrangement you are not yet sure about. Somewhere between the cattle drive and the flour on my face and the laugh I had not been prepared for, I had stopped managing and started something else. I did not name it. I was not ready to name it. There is a difference between recognizing a thing and being willing to call it by its right name, and I was not yet at the second part. But I was aware of it. Quietly and clearly, the way you are aware of a change in the weather before the change has fully arrived. It was 3 days later when Pike Morrison rode through my gate for the first time. Morning. Frost on the grass like powdered glass. I was at the corral checking the water when I heard horses, more than one, coming from the south road. I straightened and turned. 3 riders, moving with purpose rather than the loose ease of people passing through. Morrison in front, 2 men I did not recognize behind him. His pale eyes found me across the yard without searching, as if he already knew exactly where I would be. He pulled up outside the corral fence. "Mrs. Thornfield," he said, the voice of a man who has learned to sound courteous without being it. "Fine morning." "State your business," I said. His eyes moved past me, to the barn, to the house, taking inventory the way he had been sent here to do. Then he looked back at me and smiled with the half of his mouth the scar allowed him. "Mr. Hartwell has asked me to convey his concern. It seems some of your cattle have been moving close to his fence line." "That is not possible," I said. "We moved them down from the summer pasture 4 days ago." "Nevertheless," a small shrug, "he wanted you to be aware." "I am aware," I said, "that my cattle are in my lower pasture where they belong." Morrison's eyes drifted to the barn again, and then without haste, without making anything of it, he looked at the house. At the window of the kitchen, where I knew Evie was sitting at the table with the piece of canvas she had been practicing her stitches on, at the child in the window. The thing that happened in my chest in that moment was not fear. Fear comes in a rush and then recedes. What I felt was something colder and more permanent, the recognition of a specific kind of danger, the kind that wears a reasonable face and speaks in moderate tones and means every word of the harm underneath them. "Dangerous country," Morrison said, "for small ones." I heard the step behind me before Morrison's eyes shifted to it. Eli had come out of the barn. He stood 15 feet to my right, pitchfork still in hand, and he looked at Morrison with the expression of a man seeing something he has been expecting to see for some time. There was no anger in his face. It was worse than anger. It was the absolute stillness of a man who has already done all of his deciding. Morrison looked at him. Whatever he had expected to find at the Thornfield Ranch, it was not this. That was clear for just a moment on his face before he controlled it. Just a moment, the barest flicker of recalculation before the reasonable expression resettled. "I do not believe we have met," Morrison said. "No," Eli said. "We have not." A silence that had the texture of wire pulled tight. "You should check your fence line, Mrs. Thornfield," Morrison said pleasantly. "Winter has a way of making the boundaries unclear." He pulled his horse around. The 2 men behind him followed. They rode back down the south road at a walk unhurried, the way men ride when they want you to understand they are not afraid of you. I watched them until they were past the gate. I realized my hands were shaking. Not from fear, or not only from fear. From the particular anger that comes when someone looks at a child through a window and calls it a pleasantry. "He knew you were here," I said, when the sound of hoofbeats had faded. "Yes," Eli said. "He came anyway." "He came because I am here," Eli said quietly. "He needed to see whether I would be a problem." I looked at him. "And what did he decide?" Eli was quiet for a moment. His eyes were still on the south road. "I believe," he said, "that he decided he needs to speak to Hartwell before he decides anything else." That night, Eli moved his bedroll from the storage room to the main room floor between the front door and the hallway. He did it without comment while I was washing the supper dishes, and when I came out and saw it, I did not ask why. I went to the linen chest and brought him another blanket. He took it without comment either. We were not yet people who said the important things out loud, but we were beginning to understand each other well enough to act without the words. And outside, the Montana wind came harder off the mountains, carrying now the definite cold of what was coming, not a warning anymore, but a certainty. The first real test was 3 days away. Neither of us knew that yet, but we could both feel it in the particular way you feel a change in the weather before it arrives. Something was coming, and this time I was not going to face it alone. Still as told by Abigail Thornfield, moving now into the part of the story I spent the longest time learning how to tell. There are things the ground remembers that people forget. Samuel used to say that. He had a habit of saying things that sounded simple until you turned them over and found they had weight on the other side. He said it first about the soil, about how land that had been farmed hard without rest would eventually stop giving, no matter how much you asked of it. But I came to understand he meant it about more than soil. The ground around this ranch had been holding a secret for 6 months when Eli Calloway dug down beside the barn foundation and found a tin box wrapped in oilcloth. That is where this part of the story begins. Not with gunfire, not with Morrison riding through the gate, not with any of the large and obvious things. It begins with a broken shovel handle buried under 3 inches of hardpan and what Eli found underneath it. He had not told me he was going back to dig. I found out the way I found out most things Eli had decided to do, not because he told me, but because I came around the corner of the barn on a Tuesday morning and found him on his knees in the dirt, a lantern set beside him, against the gray, overcast light, his hands working carefully around something in the ground. I stopped. He heard me and looked up. He did not look guilty. He looked like a man who had been waiting to have this conversation and was relieved the waiting was done. "Come here," he said. I walked over and crouched beside him. The hole was perhaps 18 inches deep, edges clean and deliberate. He had been careful with this, not just digging, but uncovering. At the bottom sat a flat tin box, the kind used for storing tobacco or small tools, wrapped tightly in a square of oilcloth that had done its job well enough to keep out most of the moisture. "I found the shovel handle 10 days ago," he said, "when I was resetting the foundation post on the east corner. It was buried deliberate, not thrown in, laid in. Wrapped the same way as this." I looked at the box. "You waited 10 days?" "I waited until I was certain what it was and what to do about it." He met my eyes. "I did not want to bring you something I did not understand yet." I considered being angry about that. I decided it could wait. "Open it," I said. He lifted the box out of the ground and set it on the flat of his thigh. The latch had rusted but yielded to pressure. Inside, protected by the oilcloth and by whatever prayer the person who buried it had said over it, were papers. Not many. 4 sheets folded carefully, and beneath them something smaller. A hand-drawn map on heavier stock, the kind of paper surveyors used. I took the papers and read them in the gray morning light while Eli held the lantern. The first sheet was a geological survey. Technical language measurements, coordinates, but I had read enough survey documents in my years on this land to understand the essential meaning. The survey described an underground water source, an aquifer. It ran beneath 3 properties in the eastern valley, feeding the creek that all of us depended on through the driest summer months. One of those 3 properties was the Thornfield Ranch. The second sheet was a letter handwritten between 2 men whose names I did not recognize, but the letterhead at the top carried the name of one of Hartwell's holding companies. I knew that name because Samuel had pointed it out to me once when we had seen it on documents at the land registry office, and he had said quietly, the way he said things he was still thinking through, "That is Hartwell with a different coat on." The letter discussed the acquisition of properties over the aquifer. It discussed timelines. It used the word persuasion in a context that made clear persuasion was not the primary method being discussed, but rather the polite word standing in for it. The third sheet was what stopped me. It was a statement, handwritten, different hand, from the letter cramped and urgent, the writing of someone doing a thing quickly before they lost the nerve for it. It was signed at the bottom by a name I knew, Carl Briggs. Carl Briggs had worked for Samuel the first 2 years we were on the land, a quiet man from somewhere in Ohio who kept to himself and did his work without complaint. He had left suddenly in the spring, left without collecting his last week's wages, which I had thought strange, but attributed to some personal trouble I was not aware of. The statement described a meeting. Carl Briggs had been present not as a participant, but as an accidental witness in the way that working men are sometimes invisible to the people who employ them, and therefore present for things not intended to be witnessed. The meeting was between Morrison and a man Carl Briggs described as Hartwell's land agent. The meeting concerned the Thornfield property. It concerned Samuel Thornfield specifically. It concerned what should be done about Samuel Thornfield, who had seen the survey documents and who had, according to the land agent, made his intentions regarding that information clear. I read the statement twice. Then I set it on my knee and looked at the barn wall in front of me and said nothing for a long time. "Abigail." Eli's voice was careful. the voice of a man who understood what he was watching and was not going to make it worse by rushing it. "He knew," I said. My voice came out flat and even, which surprised me. Samuel knew. He had found this, or found enough of it, and he was deciding what to do. "It looks that way." "And they knew he knew." I paused. "The last night. He came home late. He had something on his face, I could see it. I knew something was wrong and he told me it was nothing." I stopped. "He was protecting me." The word came out with more edge than I intended. Eli was quiet. "He was protecting me," I said again, "and it killed him." That was the thing I had been carrying for 6 months without being able to name it. Not grief exactly. Not anger at Samuel exactly. Something more complicated than either of those, the particular weight of loving a person who loved you enough to try to carry something alone, and in doing so, left you with no way to carry it with him. I sat beside the barn wall in the cold morning light and held the papers and did not cry. I had done my crying in the weeks after Samuel died, alone and thorough, and there was a particular kind of understanding that comes after crying is finished that has its own quiet clarity. What I felt now was not grief. It was resolution. "Carl Briggs buried this," I said, "and then he left." "Afraid?" Eli said. "He saw what happened to Samuel and he hid what he knew and he ran. I cannot blame him for that." I looked at the papers in my hands. "But he left this first. He hid it where someone who knew the property would find it, where someone who was paying attention to the foundation posts would find it." "He left it for you," Eli said. "He left it for whoever was still here," I said. "He left it because he could not speak and could not stay and could not entirely let it disappear." I folded the papers carefully and put them back in the tin box. "This goes inside," I said, "under the floorboards in the bedroom. Nobody knows about it until I decide what to do with it." Eli nodded. "And Eli?" I looked at him directly. "Thank you for waiting until you understood it." He picked up the lantern and stood. "It was your grief to come to at your own pace," he said, "not mine to rush." I did not answer that. Some things you receive without responding to, because the response that would be adequate does not exist in ordinary language. I took the tin box inside and hid it and went back to work. I did not sleep that night. I lay in the dark and listened to the wind and thought about Samuel, and then I got up very quietly and put on my coat and went outside. The sky had cleared after 2 days of cloud, and the stars were extraordinary, the kind of sky you only get in Montana in autumn when the air is cold enough to be absolutely still and transparent. I stood in the yard for a moment, looking up at it. Samuel had loved nights like this. He would come outside on evenings when the sky was clear and just stand for a while, not saying anything, the way he stood when something was too large to talk about. I walked around to the back of the barn. The ground here was harder than anywhere else on the property, compacted by years of foot traffic, resistant to the frost in a way the open land was not. 2 wooden markers, simple and plain, the way Samuel had wanted things. His name, the dates, nothing more. I stood before the first marker. I had been out here many times in 6 months, always with something to say, something practical, something I was working through, the kind of talking you do with the dead that is really a form of thinking out loud. I had told him about the fence problems and the cattle counts and the letters from my brother and the weather patterns and everything that made up the daily texture of keeping the ranch alive. I had never told him what I was telling him now. "You found the survey," I said quietly. "And you didn't tell me because you thought you were keeping me safe." I paused. "I want you to understand that I know why you did it. I understand it completely, and it was the wrong decision." The wind moved through the dry grass around the markers. "You should have told me," I said. "We could have decided together. That is what together means. It means you don't carry the dangerous things alone, so the other person doesn't have to be frightened. It means the other person gets to choose to be frightened alongside you." I was quiet for a moment. "I would have chosen that," I said. "Every time." I stood there a while longer. The stars moved slightly in their slow way. The cold was significant, but I did not feel it particularly. "There is a man staying here," I said finally. "Him and his daughter. She is 5. She has your eyes, not the color, but the quality of them. That particular way of looking at a thing until you have understood it." I stopped. "I am not telling you this to explain myself. I am telling you because you knew me better than anyone, and you would want to know what is happening here." The marker said nothing, as expected. "I don't know yet what it is," I said honestly. "I am paying attention to it. That is all I can tell you right now." I put my hand briefly on the top of the marker. The wood was cold and rough under my palm. "Don't worry about the land," I said. "I am not going to let them take it." I went back inside. In the main room, Eli's shape was still under the blanket on the floor, or appeared to be. The fire in the stove had burned down to coals. I added 2 pieces of wood carefully so the sound would not wake him. As I straightened up, I saw his eyes were open. He had been awake. We looked at each other in the dim coals glow for a moment. He did not ask where I had been. I did not explain. I went back to bed. The following morning, I told Eli I needed to go into town to see Marshal Brennan. He was quiet for a moment. "Do you want me to come?" "No," I said. "I want you to stay here with Evie and keep your eyes open." He nodded. "Take the long way back. Come up from the North Road." I looked at him. "Why the North Road?" "Because Morrison came from the south," he said. "And if anyone is watching this property, they are watching the south approach." This was the kind of thinking that came from years of living in places where being observed was a daily consideration. I filed it away. "There is something else you should know," he said as I was putting on my coat. "Before you go." I waited. "The aquifer," he said. "The one on the survey. I know about it. Not from the papers I knew about it before. There is a formation in the Beartooth Range that feeds the same underground system. I saw survey work being done on it 3 years ago before I understood what it meant." He paused. "That water is worth more than the land above it. 10 years from now, this valley is going to grow, and that water is going to matter in ways it does not matter now. Hartwell knows that. He has been planning for a long time." I absorbed that. "How long?" "Long enough that Samuel was not the first person he needed to remove from this plan." The kitchen was very quiet. "Who else?" I asked. "I do not know all of them," Eli said, "but I know Morrison's work. I have seen it before. The pattern is always the same offer: first pressure, second arrange an accident, third." He looked at me steadily. "Samuel was not careless. A careful man does not have accidents." I had known that for 6 months. Hearing it said plainly by another person did something I had not expected. It did not make it worse. It made it more solid, less like a suspicion I was carrying alone, and more like a fact that existed in the world independently of my grief. "I will be back by noon," I said. Marshal Brennan's office smelled of old coffee and wood smoke, the particular combination that I had always associated with the limited and honest efforts of the law in a place too large and too complicated for the law to fully reach. Brennan himself was a compact man of 46, with a gray mustache and the careful eyes of someone who had spent years learning to read situations before they became incidents. He was not a corrupt man. He was not a cowardly man. He was a practical man operating in a territory where practical men understood that the distance between what was right and what was possible was sometimes the length of a long career. He listened to everything I told him without interrupting. I did not bring the papers. I was not ready to bring the papers yet, not until I understood more about what they would set in motion. I told him what Carl Briggs had witnessed. I told him about the aquifer. I told him about Morrison's visit and what he had said about the child in the window. When I finished, Brennan was quiet for a moment. He turned a pen over in his fingers end to end, a habit I had observed in him before when he was thinking hard. "The papers," he said. "If what you are describing is in those papers, Abigail, that is not a county matter. That is federal. Fraud on that scale if it connects to what happened to Samuel." He stopped. I need to see them. Not yet, I said. He looked at me. Why not yet? Because the moment those papers leave my property, Hartwell will know about it, I said. And I do not yet know who in this town is telling him what. Brennan set the pen down. He had the expression of a man who wanted to argue and understood that the argument would not hold. You think someone here, Morrison, was in Ruth's store asking about my fence line? I said. He knew details about my property that he should not have known unless someone was watching it or someone was talking. I do not know which, until I know those papers stay where they are. A long pause. What do you want from me then? He asked. I want you to know what exists, I said, so that if something happens to me, you know where to look and why. Brennan looked at me for a long moment. His face did a careful rearrangement, the look of a man taking full inventory of the distance between what his position allowed him to offer and what the situation actually required. The look of a man confronting the limits of what his position allows him to offer. The man you have hired, he said. Calloway. Yes. There is a story about him, from up in the Beartooth country. I know the story, I said. I know his version of it, which is the only version that accounts for all the facts. Morrison is the one Morrison is alive, I said. He was in this town 4 days ago, and if what I believe is true, then what Eli Calloway did on that mountain was not murder. It was a man defending his home and his dying wife from someone doing Hartwell's work. Brennan was quiet for a long time. If you can prove what is in those papers, he said finally, then I can move. I cannot move on rumor, Abigail, even well-founded rumor. But if the documents support what you are describing, there are federal marshals in Helena who have been interested in Hartwell's operations for 2 years. He paused. 2 years. That is how long this has been building. And how long have you known? The question sat between us. I have suspected, he said carefully. Suspicion is not proof. I stood up. Then we had better find the proof, I said. I came home by the north road. Eli was on the roof of the barn when I rode in. A shingle had come loose in the last wind, and he had gone up to fix it before the next rain found the gap. He looked down when he heard me registered that I had come from the north instead of the south, and went back to the shingle without comment. Evie was on the porch steps with her canvas and needle. She looked up when I dismounted. How are the stitches? I asked. She held up the canvas. The stitches on the left side were still slightly uneven. The stitches on the right side, done more recently, were nearly uniform. Much better, I said. I meant it. She examined my face with the particular thoroughness she brought to faces when she was trying to determine something. Then she went back to her stitching, apparently satisfied with whatever she had found. I went inside and stood in the kitchen and thought. The papers needed to get to Brennan, but not through town where every movement was observed, and not until I knew whether anyone in the valley was feeding information to Hartwell's people. That meant I needed to know who Morrison had spoken to, who besides Ruth he had visited, whether there was a pattern to what he had asked and what he had been told. I thought about Tom Patterson. Tom Patterson had been our nearest neighbor for 4 years. He had helped Samuel put up the original barn frame. He had brought food in the first week after Samuel died and had stood on this porch with his hat in his hands, looking at his boots in the way of a man who had something to say and had decided against saying it. I had thought at the time that it was simple grief, that he did not know what to say, which was common enough. Men of that generation often could not speak across the distance that death created. But he had looked at his boots for a long time, and he had not come back after that first week. I put water on for coffee and stood at the window watching Evie on the porch steps. Her dark head bent over the canvas, and I thought about Tom Patterson and his boots and the thing he had not said. He came the next morning. Not because I sent for him, he came on his own, riding up the south road mid-morning, with no particular stated purpose, which was itself unusual. Tom Patterson was not a man who rode out without a reason. I was at the corral when he arrived. Eli was in the barn. I watched Patterson dismount and tie his horse and come toward me, and I watched his face, and I saw in it what I had seen on the porch the week after Samuel died. the same calculation, the same weight. Abigail, he said. Tom. He looked around the yard, at the barn, at the house, at the new corral fence Eli had repaired. Man's doing good work, he said. He is. A pause. He turned his hat over in his hands, the same gesture as Brennan with his pen, the gesture of someone thinking hard about what to say and how. Morrison came to see me, he said finally. I waited. Came 3 days ago. Asked me about your place. How many hands you were running, what shape the buildings were in. He stopped. Asked me whether I thought you could hold on through another winter alone. And what did you tell him? He was quiet for a moment. I told him you were managing fine, that the place looked well kept. Another pause longer. That was all I told him. I looked at him steadily. Is that all you knew? The question arrived in the space between us and sat there. Patterson's jaw tightened. He looked at his hat, then at the barn, then at me. And for the first time in the months since Samuel died, I saw on his face what had actually been there all along underneath the neighborly sorrow, not just grief, but guilt. The specific guilt of a person carrying a thing they had not been able to put down and had not been able to hand over. Tom, I said quietly, tell me. He told me, standing at the corral fence, not looking at me, talking toward the middle distance in the flat voice of a man delivering something he has rehearsed and dreaded simultaneously. He had known Samuel had found something. Not the survey, he had not known the specifics. But Samuel had come to him in the last week, had come quietly and carefully, the way Samuel did things, and had told him that he believed Hartwell's interest in the Thornfield land was connected to something underground and that he was trying to find the documentation to prove it. Samuel had asked Patterson if he knew anything about Hartwell's operations in the Eastern Valley. Patterson had told him to be careful. He had not helped him. He had not told Brennan. He had told Samuel to be careful, and he had gone home, and 3 days later, Samuel was dead in a way that looked like a fall from a horse on a trail he had ridden 100 times. I knew, Patterson said. Not all of it, not enough to prove anything. But I knew it was not right, and I said nothing because I have a wife and 2 boys, and Hartwell is... He stopped. Hartwell is what he is, he said. I held the top rail of the corral fence with both hands and did not speak for a long time. In my chest, there was something moving that I needed to be careful with, an anger that if I let it speak for itself right now, would come out in a way that destroyed whatever use this conversation might be. Tom Patterson was not my enemy. Tom Patterson was a frightened man who had made the choice most frightened men make, and Samuel was dead, not because of Patterson's silence, but because of Hartwell's decision, and those were not the same thing, even though they lived close together. Morrison asked you about my ranch, I said finally. He wanted to know if I was vulnerable. Yes. And you told him I was managing. Yes. He finally looked at me. I was not going to help him, Abigail. I want you to understand that. I did not tell him anything that would... I know, I said. Tom, I know. He looked briefly as if he might come apart at the seams, then held himself together with the effort that was visible on his face. I should have spoken sooner, he said. After Samuel, I should have told you what I knew. Instead, I brought food and stood on your porch and couldn't find the words. No, I said. You couldn't find the courage. The words were there. That landed. He absorbed it without flinching, which told me something about him that he had been saying it to himself already in harsher terms than mine. What do you need from me? He said. I need you to find out who else Morrison has visited in this valley. I said, quietly, without telling anyone why. I need to know the full shape of what Hartwell is doing before I take what I have to Brennan. What do you have? Enough, I said, if we can get it to the right people. He put his hat back on, straightened his shoulders in the way of a man taking something back up that he had set down for too long. Give me 3 days, he said. You have too, I said. He nodded and went to his horse. That evening, the three of us ate supper later than usual. The cattle work had run long, and the light had gone by the time we sat down. The lamp making its small, warm circle on the table, the stove keeping the cold outside where it belonged. Evie was tired from the day she had been helping with the younger calves, learning how to move around them without startling them, and the concentration of it had worn her in the good way that honest work wears a person. She ate steadily and without much talking, which was not unusual for her, but there was a quality to her quiet tonight that was different from her ordinary quiet. More settled, less watchful. She was watching me, though, in her particular sideways way from under her dark lashes when she thought I was not looking, checking something, running some internal calculation about whatever she had seen in my face over the course of the day. After supper, she did not go immediately to the back room. She sat with her hands folded on the table for a moment, and then she looked at me directly. "Are you frightened?" she asked. It was the longest sentence she had spoken to me since they arrived. The directness of it, the simple plain courage of a 5-year-old asking an adult a question that adults do not usually ask each other, caught me somewhere I was not defended. I looked at her. I thought about lying or softening it or giving her the comfortable answer. "A little," I said. "Not enough to change anything I am doing, but yes, a little." She considered that, nodded once with the gravity of someone filing away important information. "Papa gets frightened too," she said. "He just gets very still instead." I looked across the table at Eli, who was looking at his daughter with an expression I was beginning to recognize, the one that appeared when she said something that surprised him, which was more often than he anticipated. "Does he?" I said. "But then he does the thing anyway," she said, and that appeared to settle the matter for her. She climbed down from her chair and went to the back room to prepare for bed. The kitchen was quiet. "Very still," I said to Eli. "I have been told," he said. Outside, the wind was picking up. Not the ordinary evening wind, this had a different quality to it, a weight and persistence that meant it was coming off something significant. I went to the window and looked out. The sky to the north was a solid dark that was not quite the dark of night, too uniform, too low at the horizon. "Snow," Eli said from behind me. He had come to stand near the window without me hearing him move. "How long?" I asked. "Before morning." We stood at the window looking at the sky. Not close, but near enough that I was aware of the space between us. Aware of it as a particular and specific distance. Not simply empty space, but something with its own character. "Patterson was here this morning," I said. "I know. I saw him ride in." He knew something about Samuel. He had known for months and said nothing. I paused. He is trying to make it right now. Or trying to begin to. Eli was quiet for a moment. "Can he be trusted?" "I think he has used up all his willingness to be a coward," I said. "In my experience, that is more reliable than a man who has never been frightened. A man who has been a coward and knows it has something to prove." Eli considered that. "That is a particular kind of thinking." "I have had time to develop particular kinds of thinking," I said. The first flake of snow appeared against the window glass, not falling exactly but moving sideways in the wind, which was how snow moved in Montana when it meant business. "Eli," I said. "Yes. If something happens, if something goes wrong before we get those papers to Brennan, the box is under the floorboard on the left side of the bedroom, the third board from the window." A pause. "Nothing is going to happen," he said. "I know," I said. "Tell me you heard me anyway." "Third board from the window," he said. "Left side." "Thank you." I turned from the window. He was closer than I had realized. The room was not large, and we had both been looking at the same piece of sky, and the distance between us had become something I was acutely aware of, without having intended to become aware of it. I stepped back. "Good night, Eli." "Good night." I went to bed and lay in the dark and listened to the snow begin in earnest, the hush of it, the way snow absorbs sound and leaves a silence that is different in quality from ordinary silence. Fuller somehow. More absolute. In the main room, I could hear Eli banking the stove for the night. Small sounds, domestic and ordinary. The sounds of a house being tended. Samuel used to bank the stove. I lay still and let that thought exist, without trying to do anything with it. The snow fell for 2 days. We were cut off from the south road entirely by the end of the first day. The drifts came up to the lower fence rails, and the temperature dropped to a place where breath hung visible in the air, even inside the barn. We moved through the necessary work in shortened shifts, rotating inside to warm up, rotating back out. Evie ran a fever on the second night, not dangerously high, but enough that both Eli and I were awake through most of it, taking turns with cold cloths and the helpless attentiveness of adults watching a small person fight off something they cannot fight for her. It was in the deep of that second night, when the fever had come down enough that Evie was sleeping more easily and the immediate fear had released its grip, that Eli and I sat beside the stove in the main room and talked in the way that 2 days of close quarters and a sick child had made possible, without the usual careful distance, without the managed presentation of two people who are still deciding how much to trust. He told me about Martha. Not the death, he had told me that part already on a different night. He told me about before. About the woman. She was practical and funny in a dry, precise way. He said the kind of funny that caught you off guard because she delivered it deadpan and you were already 3 sentences past it before you realized. About the way she had insisted on planting a kitchen garden the first summer on the mountain, even though the season was too short for half of what she planted, because she said a garden was a statement of intention. About how she had held Evie the first time in the cabin on the mountain and looked at Eli over the baby's head with an expression he had never been able to fully describe, but had never stopped seeing. He stopped. She wanted to teach Evie to sew, he said. I know, I said. You told me. She did not get to teach her much of anything, he said. She was sick for so long, and then she was gone, and Evie was 2.5, and He stopped again. Eli, I said. I did not know how to be both of them, he said quietly. I knew how to be her father. I did not know how to be everything else she needed, and I could not. I kept thinking if I could just get to the next place the next season I would figure out what I was missing. But it was not a place problem. The fire in the stove made its small sounds. No, I said. It was not. He looked at me. What you are doing with her, the sewing, the eggs, the cattle work today. She is different here than she has been anywhere. I did not answer immediately. I thought about Evie's hand closing around the silver dollar. I thought about the stitch on the right side of the canvas nearly uniform. I thought about the sideways look from under dark lashes checking whether I was frightened. She is extraordinary, I said. You should know that. Not because she manages well, though she does, but because the way she pays attention to the world, the way she thinks before she speaks, the questions she chooses to ask. I paused. That is not something that happened to her. That is who she is. Miss. Eli was quiet for a long moment. I have something to tell you, I said. Something I have not told anyone. He waited. Samuel and I lost a child, I said. Before all of this. 4 months along. No warning. I said it plainly, the way I had learned to carry it, not roughly, but without wrapping it in softness that would make it harder to hold. Nobody in this valley knows. We did not speak of it. The custom of the time. He was still. I am telling you, I said, because you told me about Martha, and because I think you should understand something about what your daughter means to the person who is teaching her to make small, tight stitches. The storm pressed at the walls of the house, snow against glass, wind in the eaves. I am sorry, Eli said, for what you and Samuel lost. Yes, I said, and I am sorry for Martha, and for what Evie carries without being old enough to fully carry it. We sat for a while in the particular silence of two people who have said true things and do not need to fill the space after. Then from the back room came a small sound, Evie shifting in her sleep, settling, and both of us looked toward the doorway at the same moment. When I turned back, Eli was looking at me with an expression I did not examine closely. I looked at the stove instead. The fever is down, I said. Try to sleep." "You too," he said. I went back to my room and lay in the dark, listening to the storm. Somewhere in the middle of the night, it began to ease. By the time a gray dawn came through the window, the wind had stopped entirely, and the world outside was white and absolute and still. And in that stillness, before anyone else was awake, I lay in my bed and understood something I had been understanding for some time without being willing to call it by its name. I was not alone in this house, not in the practical sense that had been true for 2 weeks, but in some other sense, the deeper one, the kind of alone that has nothing to do with how many people are in the building. That kind of alone had ended somewhere in the past 2 days without announcement, the way the snow had finally ended, simply not present anymore, the absence of something you had not noticed until it stopped. The morning after the storm broke, Patterson came. He had ridden through drifts that would have stopped most men, and his horse was blown, and his coat was white with it, and he came through the gate with the look of a man who has decided to do a thing and is doing it before his nerve fails. Eli and I were both in the yard when he rode in. We had been clearing the path to the barn. He dismounted and looked at us both and said, "Morrison is not working alone inside this valley. There are 2 others. I have names." He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "And there is something else," he said. His voice had changed lower with a quality I had not heard in it before. "Morrison was in town yesterday, before the storm. He went to see Billy Crane at the saloon." Patterson looked at me directly. "He was asking about your ranch hand, whether Calloway had any family elsewhere, whether anyone would come looking for him if something happened." The yard was very quiet. "When did he come here last?" Eli asked. His voice was even, the very still kind of even. "5 days ago," I said. "Then he is done with asking questions," Eli said. He looked at me. I looked at him. And in the cold, bright morning after the storm, with Patterson standing between us holding a piece of paper with names on it, we both understood that the time for preparing was ending. What came next was not preparation. What came next was the thing itself. Still as told by Abigail Thornfield, this is the part I always tell last. Not because it is the hardest, but because it deserves to arrive after everything else has been said. Morrison came back on a Tuesday. I know it was Tuesday because I had been marking the days in the ledger since Patterson's visit. Not counting down exactly, but keeping track the way you keep track of weather when you know something is moving toward you and you cannot see it yet, but you can feel it in the quality of the air. 7 days had passed since the storm broke. 7 days in which Eli and I had moved through the work of the ranch with a particular attentiveness, not fearful, not frantic, but the way a person walks a trail they know is uneven in the dark. Careful where they place each step. In those 7 days, 2 things had happened that mattered. The first was that Patterson had delivered his information to Brennan, the names of the 2 men inside the valley who had been passing word to Morrison, the pattern of what they had reported and when. Brennan had sent a rider to Helena. Federal interest, he had told me quietly when I saw him in town, was already established. The papers from the tin box which I had finally carried to his office myself, wrapped in plain cloth and tucked inside a flour sack, had done what Carl Briggs had intended them to do when he buried them beside my barn foundation on a frightened night in spring. Brennan said, "This is enough." I said, "Make sure it reaches the right people before Hartwell knows it exists." He said he would. I believed him not because I was certain, but because I had run out of alternatives, and certainty had never been part of the arrangement. The second thing that happened was smaller and did not involve any document or any law. Evie called me by a name. It was the morning of the 6th day after the storm. I was at the stove, and she was behind me at the table working on a new piece of canvas, larger than the practice scrap, a proper piece of muslin I had given her because her stitches had earned it. She said something, low, not quite directed at me the way she sometimes narrated to herself when she was concentrating. I turned around. "What did you say?" She looked up. In her eyes was that particular expression, the one that appeared when she had done something she was not certain was permitted and was waiting to understand the consequence. I said, she repeated carefully, that the thread keeps knotting. Mama always said to run it through beeswax. The kitchen was very still. She had not said my mama or Martha. She had not said it tentatively or with apology in her voice. She had said it the way a child says mama, when the word is simply the right word for the person and no further explanation is required. I held the spoon I had been using and looked at her for a moment. There is beeswax in the second drawer, I said. The wooden one on the left. She climbed down from her chair and found it and climbed back up and ran her thread through it with the focused expression she brought to all technical problems. The knot did not come back. I turned to the stove. I stood at that stove for a little longer than necessary, my back to the room, doing nothing in particular with the spoon. I will not try to tell you exactly what I felt. I will only tell you that whatever had been closed inside me, quietly and completely, the way it had closed on that night 2 years before the Calloways ever came to this gate, opened further. Not all the way, but further than I had expected anything to open again. And I decided that further was sufficient. That further was in fact more than I had asked for. And I decided standing at that stove that further was enough. That further was in fact a great deal. Morrison came before dawn on Tuesday. Eli heard them first. I do not know whether he had been sleeping, I suspect not. I had not been sleeping either, though I had been lying still in the dark, doing a reasonable imitation of it. The sound was hoofbeats from the south, multiple horses moving faster than men who have innocent business move at that hour. Eli's voice came through the wall, quiet and clear. Abigail. I hear them, I said. I was already sitting up. Take Evie to the root cellar. I know. I was at Evie's door in less than a minute. She was already awake. She had heard or felt the change in the house, the way children feel things before they can name them. She was sitting up in her bedroll with her doll pressed against her chest and her eyes very large in the dark. We are going to the root cellar, I said quietly. Bring your blanket. Is it Morrison? She asked, the directness of it again, that plain, undecorated courage. Probably, I said. Come on. I moved her through the kitchen and out the back into the cold, pre-dawn dark. The root cellar entrance was behind the woodpile, a low wooden door set into the earth-covered, invisible from the south approach. I had cleared the snow from it 3 days ago, telling myself it was routine maintenance. I settled Evie inside on the old wool blanket I had placed there earlier in the week, telling myself then, too, that it was routine. Stay here, I said. Do not come up until I or your father come for you. Do you understand? Yes, she said. Evie. I took her face in both my hands in the dark, the way I had seen Eli do when he needed her full attention. You are the bravest person I know. She put both her small hands over mine for just a moment. Then I closed the door. I came around the front of the house with the rifle as Morrison's riders came through the gate. Eli was already on the porch. He had dressed and taken his position without haste, his rifle held at his side. In the gray pre-dawn, he looked exactly like what he was, a man who had been expecting this and had done all his deciding well in advance. Morrison pulled up in the yard with 7 men behind him, 8 in total. The number was intended to make a statement. It made one, though perhaps not the one Morrison intended. 8 men before sunrise tells you that the man who sent them is frightened of what 2 people and a tin box of documents represent. Boy, Morrison said, not a name at all, just the word a man uses when he wants to remind someone they do not matter enough to be addressed properly. He had never once used Eli's correct name in any of these encounters. I had noticed that from the first visit. It was a small dominance the kind petty men practice to remind themselves of a position they are not entirely certain they hold. Calloway, Eli said, giving Morrison his own name back plainly and without heat. Calloway, Eli said. Morrison looked at him, then at me. His pale eyes moved to the rifle in my hands with the expression of a man recalculating. We have business with you, Calloway, he said. Step down off that porch. State your business from there, Eli said. Hartwell says you have been interfering with his operations, moving his cattle, running his men off his fence line. Hartwell can say what he likes, I said. His men have not been near our fence line. Morrison looked at me. Something had shifted in his face from previous visits. The performance of reasonableness was gone. This was the face underneath it, and it was simpler and more honest and considerably more dangerous. Mrs. Thornfield, he said, this does not concern you. Everything on this property concerns me, I said, including the documents I delivered to Marshal Brennan 4 days ago, which I imagine concern you considerably. Morrison went very still. That stillness told me everything about what he had not yet known and now did. What documents? He said. Not a question. The voice of a man buying time to think. The survey, I said. The letters. Carl Briggs's statement. I kept my voice the same temperature I would use to discuss weather. Federal marshals have been called from Helena. I expect they will arrive within the week. The yard was absolutely quiet. The 7 men behind Morrison looked at each other with the uncertainty of men who have just realized the job has changed, who have just understood that the thing they were hired to do has become considerably more expensive than the original price. Morrison's hand moved toward his coat. Eli stepped off the porch. He did not run. He did not shout. He simply stepped down and walked forward with the directness of a man going somewhere he has already decided to go, and something about the quality of that movement, the absence of hesitation in it, the complete lack of performance made 2 of the men behind Morrison pull their horses back a step without being aware they were doing it. Move your hand away from that coat, Eli said. He was 10 feet from Morrison now. Move it away and think carefully about the next 5 minutes. Morrison looked at him. I had watched men look at each other across distances like this before in the years on the frontier, and I had learned that what happens in those moments is not about the guns. It is about what each man can read in the other's face. What each man understands about what the other is willing to do and how far that willingness goes. Whatever Morrison read in Eli Calloway's face in that moment, it was accurate. His hand moved away from his coat. This is not finished, Morrison said. No. Eli agreed. It is not. But it is finished for tonight. From the south road came the sound of more horses, many more. Patterson came through the gate first, then Brennan, and behind them, a line of riders, neighbors, most of them men I recognized from the Valley men who had received word the previous evening through channels that Patterson had spent a week building carefully and quietly. Behind Brennan rode 2 men I did not recognize, federal badges catching the first gray light of the approaching dawn. The yard filled with horses and men and the kind of tension that has weight and texture like a rope pulled between too many hands. Brennan rode to the center of the yard and looked at Morrison with the expression of a man who has waited a long time for a particular moment. Morrison, he said, I have a warrant. Morrison was taken that morning. His lawyer had him released on bond within 3 weeks. Hartwell's money could still buy time even when it could no longer buy outcomes. That was the last thing Hartwell's money bought. I will not tell you that what followed was clean or simple. It was not. The law moves at its own pace, and that pace is not the pace of a story. Hartwell was not arrested that morning. Morrison was taken, and the 2 men from the valley who had been feeding him information were named, and the federal marshals collected what Brennan had gathered and rode back toward Helena with the tin box and its contents, and Carl Briggs's cramped and frightened handwriting. Weeks passed. Then more weeks. Hartwell sent a lawyer first, then 2 lawyers, then a silence that was worse than lawyers, because silence meant he was thinking carefully about his next approach. Brennan told me to be patient. I told him patience was not something that came naturally to a woman watching 300 head of cattle through a Montana winter while waiting to find out whether the law moved faster than Hartwell's money. He said, "It will hold." I said, "It had better." It held. The federal case took months to build fully, and I will not pretend that waiting for it was easy. But Hartwell's operations were larger than the Thornfield land. The Aquifer Survey had exposed a pattern that reached into 3 counties and implicated men whose names surprised even Brennan. When that structure began to come apart, it came apart thoroughly. Cyrus Hartwell was formally charged in late winter. By the time spring came to the valley, his land holdings were in the hands of federal receivers, and the men who had worked for him in the particular capacity Morrison had worked were scattered or in custody. Morrison himself did not face trial. Morrison came back one last time on a February morning when Evie was in school in town and Eli and I were alone on the property. He came alone, which told me he had nothing left behind him. He came to the barn, and what happened there, I am not going to describe in detail because it was not the kind of thing that benefits from description. I heard the shot from the kitchen. I put down the coffee cup I was holding and stood at the counter with one hand flat on the wood and waited. Eli came out of the barn and looked at me across the yard. I looked back at him. He nodded once. I nodded once. That was all. Later, when Brennan had come and done what needed doing, and the light was going, and Evie was back from town and fed and in bed, Eli sat on the porch in the cold, and I brought out 2 cups of coffee and sat beside him. He was looking at the dark mountains. I did not want it to end that way, he said. I know, I said. It was the same as the mountain, he said. The same calculation, the same answer. Yes, I said. I keep hoping there will be a different answer, he said. And there never is. I held my coffee cup in both hands and looked at the stars coming out above the eastern ridge. The clear, cold stars of a Montana winter night, indifferent and brilliant and permanent in their way. You came down off that mountain, I said. You kept going. You are here. He was quiet. That is the different answer, I said. Not the moment in the barn, the fact that you are sitting on this porch. He looked at me. In the dark, his face was mostly shadow, but I could see his eyes, and what was in them was the look of a man who has been told a true thing and is deciding whether to let it settle. Evie is asleep inside, he said. She is. This porch, he said. This house. He looked at the yard, the barn, the mountains beyond. I have been on this land for 4 months, and I know every board of it. You repaired most of them, I said. Yes. A pause. I do not want to leave. The words were simple and direct the way he said things when he had decided to say them. You are not leaving, I said. There are still 12 fence posts on the south line that need resetting in the spring. He looked at me steadily. Abigail, he said. Eli, I said. A pause. That is not what I mean, he said. I know what you mean, I said. The stars moved in their slow wheel above the mountains. The cold sat around us, the way cold sits on a clear winter night, clean and absolute and honest. Marry me, he said. Not for the ranch, not for safety, not for Evie, though she is a part of it, and I will not pretend otherwise. He looked at me. Because I do not want to fix one more thing on this property without being the person who is supposed to be here. I looked at the mountains for a moment. I thought about Samuel. I thought about what I had said at his grave on the night of the first storm, that I would not let the land die, that I understood now what he had meant by it. I thought about a door that had been closed and was now open not all the way, but enough to let in the air. You have been the person who is supposed to be here, I said, since the 3rd day. He waited. Yes, I said. We married in the spring under the cottonwood tree. The whole valley came. Patterson stood beside me like family, which he had become not cleanly or without cost, but in the way that honest things are earned through the reckoning that cost requires. Ruth Hadley brought 3 pies and managed to cry and look satisfied about it simultaneously. Brennan shook Eli's hand for a long time without saying anything, which from Brennan was equivalent to a speech. Evie scattered wildflowers. She had collected them for a week beforehand, pressing them between the pages of the household accounts ledger and bringing them to me each evening to inspect. Wild asters mostly, and the last of the autumn gold that grew along the creek. She carried them in her apron and distributed them with the seriousness of someone discharging an important duty. After the ceremony, when the fiddles had started and the yard was full of the noise of people who had been through something together and were glad to be on the other side of it, Evie found me at the edge of the gathering. She stood beside me looking out at the yard. People dancing, children running the barn lit from inside with lanterns. "Are we a real family now?" she asked. I looked down at her. Her dark hair had been braided carefully. Eli had gotten better at it over the months through practice and persistence and the particular determination of a man who decides to learn something. She was wearing a dress that Ruth Hadley had helped me make blue wool with the hem at exactly the right length. "We were a real family," I said, before any of this. She considered that with her characteristic thoroughness. Before the wedding. Before the wedding. Before Morrison. Before Morrison. Before the snow. Before the snow. She was quiet, working backward. "The bread," she said finally. "When we made the bread and it came out wrong." "Yes," I said. "Around then." She nodded. That settled it for her. She went back to scattering the last of her flowers. Eli appeared at my shoulder. We stood together, watching the yard, the people, the light, the cottonwood tree holding its bare spring branches above it all. "She says we were a family when we made the bread," I told him. He thought about it. "She is not wrong." "No," I said. "She never really is." "That was many years ago now, child. The ranch is still here. The barn has been rebuilt once, after Morrison's fire once, when the roof gave, under a particularly ambitious February. The cottonwood tree is taller than it was. The fence line that Eli reset in the spring of our first year together has held through more winters than I have kept count of. Eli's hair went fully gray in his 50s, which he took with considerably more grace than I took mine. He is inside now, probably asleep in the chair by the stove, which is where he takes himself on cold afternoons when he thinks no one will notice. Evie is a grown woman. She lives 20 miles north with her husband and 3 children, and she visits in the way of people who genuinely want to be here, rather than people who feel they should. She taught her oldest daughter to sew last summer, sitting at this same table, and I sat across the room, pretending to read, and watched every minute of it. "Small stitches," she told her daughter. "Take your time. The children that came after ours, and the ones we took in over the years, the strays and orphans and children of circumstances, which is most of us. When you look at it, honestly, they filled this house in the way Samuel once said. A table fills, not always easily, not without grief and difficulty, and the ordinary hard work of people learning to be in the same place together. But filled." The girl beside me had not spoken in a long while. I looked over at her. She was watching the yard, watching the children running their circles around the cottonwood tree, watching the light go amber on the barn boards, watching all of it with the expression of someone who asked a simple question and received something considerably larger in return. "I thought you were going to tell me about the fences," she said finally. "Or the cattle." "I know," I said. "That is what most people expect." She was quiet for another moment. Then, "I'm glad you didn't." I looked at her. She had her mother's eyes, my brother's daughter, and my brother had always looked at the world straight on without blinking. It was good to see that had passed down. "So am I," I said. "You asked me why I never left this place. I have given you the answer in the long way, which is the only way it can be given honestly. But if you want it in the short way, in the way I would say it, standing at that gate on an October afternoon, with a rifle in my hands and the wind going through my bones, I did not leave, because one evening a man took off his hat at my fence, and a small girl walked straight to my well and looked down into it. And something in me recognized what I was seeing before my mind had caught up with the recognition. I did not leave because some part of me understood, before I could have said so, that what was being offered at that gate was the thing Samuel had meant when he said, "Don't let this land die." He did not mean the cattle. He did not mean the fences. He meant this, the living of it, the choosing to stay and fill it up with whatever life is willing to bring. I put the rifle down, and that child was the bravest thing I ever did. The wind is coming up again. You hear it? Same wind, same mountains. Come inside. I will put coffee on. There is more to tell, there is always more to tell. But that is the heart of it right there. That is the heart.